So, welcome everybody to the first in our strand of technology debates. So, the robots are coming, friends or foe. So, I think this should prove to be a very interesting, exciting debate. First of all, I'd like to thank our session partners. That's Tata Consultancy Services. For me, this debate is about a number of things. In one sense, robots are said to undermine us and take away our jobs, especially right now when many kind of Western economies especially are very fragile and not very open to growth. However, could that argument also be about a more general anxiety about the economy full stop, that we're using robots as the excuse to sort of project our sort of wider, deeper concerns about growth? Or alternatively, because of the sheer potential of robots and the technology, advanced technology, are robots encroaching too far into our lives perhaps? And if so, is that actually making us question what it means to be human? If we're asking robots to care for us, to even augment our physical selves, does that challenge our own morality or physicality? That's kind of like two very sort of differing ends of this discussion, which I think should make a very interesting kind of morning. And of course, to do that, we've got a great panel of speakers who can really, I hope, open up many of these arguments for you. So what I want to do, very quickly introduce the speakers. If you want to know more about them, of course, look at the Battle of Ideas website and look at their full biographies and so on. So first, on my right, we have Isabel Jenkins, who's partner capital market consulting and technology at PwC, and PwC are one of the main Battle of Ideas sponsors. On the far left, then, we have Alan Winfield, Professor of Electronic Engineering, Director Science Communication Unit and University of the West of England. Next to speak will be Francis Coppola, Associate Editor Piera, contributor to Nesta's Our Work Here Is Done, Exploring the Frontiers of Robot Technology. And then next will be Ashok Krish, who is Head Social Media Workplace Reimagination Practice at TCS Digital Enterprise. And then last to speak will be Timandra Harkness, who's a journalist, writer, broadcaster, presenter, The Singularity and other BBC Radio 4 programmes, writer and performer, science-based comedy shows, science-based comedy shows, including Brain Sex. Okay? I would just also like to point out, I did actually invite a robot to speak, but he left a voicemail saying he'll get back to me from the future, so maybe he'll turn up. Okay, it's corny, but I have to try and bring it in. Right, so let's kick things off. Isabel.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. The UK is not good at implementing technology projects, investing technology, or even considering technology as important. I think that the biggest risk to the UK is not that robots will come in and take over all of our jobs, is that the UK will not invest properly in robotics and actually will find other countries prioritise it more and that we fundamentally will get left behind. I started my career as an electronics engineer. Along with a number of my peers, I moved into financial services because it was fundamentally better rewarded. And at the time, and I say at the time, it was better regarded. I used to head up PwC's consulting graduate recruitment, and I see that same attitude amongst UK graduates that we work with at the moment. They don't tend to think that technology is well regarded within the UK, and I think that has a major implication for UK and our ability to deliver and implement technology projects and programmes. I now spend a considerable amount of my time working with the UK banking sector, and that is really looking at the IT that we've inherited from the last 20 years, in which we haven't been well invested, and that fundamentally we are now having to spend a lot of time going back to make sure that that banking technology can cope with the demands of the day-to-day life that we put upon it. And it's not just the banks. I mean, we all read the papers. Time after time, we see details of failed IT projects, areas within the UK that haven't been given the proper investment, whether that is the National Health Service technology, whether that's the Passports Agency, whether it's child support. Continually within the UK, we don't invest within technology. We don't consider IT and technology to be the kind of skilled, revered profession that it is in other countries such as Israel, such as India, and other new and developing economies. If we take the definition of what a robot is, and that fundamentally is a machine automating manual processes, we deal with those every day, whether that's going to the ATM, whether that's when I go to Sainsbury's and I use the self-service checkout, whether that's going to the car wash. We come across robots every day, and yet in the UK, I read in the newspaper this morning, when we're talking about caring robots, the US, Japan are really looking forward to caring robots. In the UK, we think they're going to be evil. Yes, we need to consider the social impact of robots and what it means to our economy and jobs. And I think initiatives that other European nations have taken, such as the Norwegian Oil Fund, where they took the excess wealth from oil and put that into a state fund that would invest in the future of Norway. And that fund now owns 1% of all global equities. I think we need to look at schemes like that. But for me, the big issue is making sure that we invest and we harness the power of robots and we don't get left behind.
So, Alan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. Most roboticists are driven by high ideals. We are motivated by a firm belief that our robots will benefit society. So working on surgical robotics, search and rescue robots, robots for assisted living, robots that can generate electricity from waste. My colleagues in the Bristol Robotics Lab want to change the world for the better. The lab startup companies are equally altruistic. So one is developing, for instance, low-cost robotic prosthetic hands for amputees. 3 others are developing materials, including low-cost robots for education. Whatever their politics, these good men and women would, I suspect, be horrified by the idea that their robots might, in the end, serve to further enrich the 0.1%, rather than extend the reach of robotics to the neediest in society. I was once an idealist, convinced that brilliant inventions would change society for the better just by virtue of being brilliant. I'm older now. For the past 5 years or so, I've become an advocate for robot ethics. But in the real world, ethics need teeth. In other words, we need to move from ethical principles to standards to legislation. So I'm really very pleased indeed to tell you that in the last few days, in fact, the British Standards Institute Working Group on Robot Ethics, in fact, there is one, which is amazing, has published for comments, I have it right here, a proposed new guide to the ethical design and application of robots and robotic systems. And in the draft, we've identified ethical hazards associated with the use of robots. And we suggest guidance to either eliminate or mitigate the risks associated with these ethical hazards. I'm not going to list them because I would use up more than my allotted few minutes. But we outline, in fact, 15 very high-level ethical hazards under 4 headings: societal, use and application, legal and financial, and environmental. Now, like any transformative technology, robotics holds both promise and peril. As a society, we need to understand, debate, and reach an informed consensus about what robots should do for us, and perhaps even more importantly, should not do. Ladies and gentlemen, robotics, I believe, needs to get political. Thank you.
So, Francis, let's have your thoughts.
We live in an age of fear, don't we? We fear. What do we fear? Loss. Loss of wealth, loss of health, loss of role, loss of connection, loss of ourselves, loss of our privileged position on this planet. I think the fear of automation, the dreaded robots, is more a generalised fear of the unknown than anything else. Robots will eat all our jobs, modern-day Luddites. Robots are watching us, conspiracy theorists. Robots are taking over the world. But they aren't. However, having said that, our fears are perhaps partly justified. Last September, there was a research paper by Frey and Osborne, no, not that Osborne, which scared the world. It concluded that as many as half of all American jobs could be automated. The capitalist system now threatened the destruction of the American way of life. Terrible. The Atlantic listed some of the jobs at risk, and it included people like accountants. I don't know if I'm terribly sorry to see the back of those, really. But they also listed some of the jobs least at risk, and it's interesting what they were. They were people like social workers, therapists, managers, actually, firefighters, and for some reason, this I don't understand, dentists. It seems that robots can't do everything. There are still, and for the foreseeable future will continue to be, many things that humans are much better at. And what's interesting is generally the nature of these jobs. The jobs most at risk from automation are those that are easy to automate, and generally they are not things that deal with the uncertain, the unpredictable, and above all with humans. The jobs least at risk, by and large, are those that do. And creative jobs, particularly, seem to feature large in the least at risk category. But of course, both lists were jobs that exist now. Yet the jobs of the future may be very different. It's very hard to predict what jobs that exist now will still exist in 5 years' time, let alone 50. When I was a small child, no one could have foreseen that 50 years later, yes, I've displayed my age, I would be writing articles using a computer and distributing them on something called the internet. That was the province of science fiction. And yet, some things never change. Although the medium I used to write didn't exist 50 years ago, writing did, so did reading, so did imagination. A robot could attend a conference and report on the proceedings. That type of journalism is one of the jobs most at risk. But creative, thoughtful writing remains the province of humans. And gazing into my crystal ball, I predict that will remain the case. And caring, too, will remain largely the province of humans. I think caring jobs are, in many ways, the jobs of the future, but perhaps not caring as we think of it now, which is caring for people's physical needs. I think increasingly we can automate that. In Japan, particularly, they're looking very much at automating the physical side of caring for the elderly. But robots can't meet humans' emotional needs, our desperate need for connection, for social interaction, for love. Those aspects of care will remain the province of humans. So, for example, I could imagine a future in which, when I go to my hairdresser salon, I still deal with a hairdresser, but she doesn't cut my hair. She discusses with me everything I've been doing and how my life is going and what kind of hairstyle I would like and what colour of the rainbow I would like to paint it, and then it gets a robot to do the actual work. And I believe that that fusion of creative work, social work and technical is like to define the work of the future. We will work in partnership with robots. Robots aren't going to replace us. There are things that we do best, there are things that they do best. And I think this is a real golden opportunity to eliminate the sort of work that humans actually don't like doing, like cleaning toilets. Isabel and I had a little conversation on the way up here about cleaning toilets. Wouldn't it be nice to get robots to do that? We can eliminate the responsibility to have someone spending their life cleaning toilets. They can spend their life doing clever and beautiful things and interacting with each other and caring for each other. And I think that's a golden opportunity. But it does require a shift of attitude, not on the part of the robots, but on the part of the humans. For much of history, we valued producing more than caring. Caring jobs are poorly paid relative to producing jobs, or even not paid at all. But in the future, robots will be able to produce all we need far more efficiently than we can. And the jobs where humans will be needed, and therefore valued, will be the ones where robots can't cope. And that means the caring jobs that we don't currently value. We have to rethink what we mean by value in our society. So I believe the future lies in partnership with each other, with robots, and perhaps in the distant future it will become more than just a partnership. Perhaps in the future there'll be physical integration of humans and technology. Is this scary? Maybe. The prospect of our children being cyborgs seems alien to us. Mind control by means of implanted devices has been the subject of horror movies. But it could be benign. Telepathy and the hive mind have been, on the whole, positively regarded in science fiction. I personally tend to take a positive view of things. I like the idea of interconnection. But in the end, whether the technology we create is used for better or for worse is our decision. Robots are only a threat because we fear what humans will do with them. It's not robots that we fear. Justifiably, it is other humans. Thank you.
Ashok.
So I'm coming from IT. I'm going to speak about the distinctly unglamorous side of robotic automation. I think the strange thing is that we all have this notion of humanoid robots and all these other sci-fi Terminator type visions of the future. But what I want to speak to you about is the fact that for the last 50 years, robotic automation has been an integral part of our society. We've just not noticed it. We're starting to have the discussions now as the intersection of computing power and the ability for, well, middle-class jobs to be automated is now when we start paying attention, right? So if you really look at it, there's an interesting anecdote. In the 1930s, there used to be a class of jobs called the computer, which was actually a human being, by the way. A computer was a human being who used to solve differential equations for a living, for NASA, and so on. So these were people who used to solve things that they didn't have computers to solve, right? And since then, now most of us don't remember that a computer used to refer to a human being. It's now not a human being anymore, right? More interestingly, any of you who are using Google, any of you using the internet are using a phenomenal amount of robotic automation. Anytime you misspell a word and Google tells you, did you actually mean this? That's a machine learning algorithm that's based on how human beings misspell words. It's essentially that. There is a good amount of automation there. Information classification is another crucial thing that is significantly now automated, right? Now, Google Translate. Many of us, have fun trying to translate between, say, English to Chinese and Chinese to back and see how a lot of stuff gets lost in translation. But the fact of the matter is that, let me give you a practical example. When in IT, we hire human translators to translate technology documents from Spanish to English, those translators are not technically savvy. We lose a lot in translation. In many cases, machine translation is actually better. Right? So even if it won't do a great job of translating William Shakespeare, it still does a better job of translating technology specs. Right? So here's another thing. In the retail side, all of us hate it. You go to Sainsbury's, you go to a Tesco, you now don't have human beings in the checkout counters. All of these are now automated thanks to a good amount of machine learning technology. The interesting thing, scientists struggled a lot to figure out how to recognize objects. So that was a big problem. We're still not perfect at it. Drones don't do it very well, apparently. Which is why we have collateral damage and so on. But the interesting thing is that we got around that problem by essentially making recognition have to do with barcodes, right? Human beings, our eyes are not great at reading barcodes, but computer cameras are great at reading barcodes, right? So while it's not perfect, but it is getting better, right? So what you can see is that in retail, it's estimated that 5 million jobs were not lost, but simply not created in the last 10 years, simply because many of those menial things have now been automated, right? Transportation, right? Self-driving cars. 1 year ago, when I saw the Google demo, I was thinking, okay, it's fine for them to drive this car around the Google campus, not really going to be practical. But I saw the demo a couple of weeks back, and I said, now there are states in the US that have given licenses to self-driving cars, right? They've genuinely gotten better than human beings. I still don't believe they can manage China or India, at least the traffic there. But here's the thing, right? As a technology optimist, I think they'll eventually crack that puzzle, right? So I think that's really. Now here's, so another interesting example, 70% of all trades in the US stock exchange are done by algorithms. And they've been done by algorithms for quite a while now, right? So all of that fighting, and shouting on the sort of the stock exchange floor represents a very, very small percentage of actual trades. And these algorithms actually do trades in microseconds and nanoseconds. So that's the level, to the point where the complexity is now beyond human understanding. That in many cases, some of these artificial crashes that happen in the market are now, the scientists are saying it's too complex, we can't explain it, because the machines have gotten too complex right now. Now, it's not just that. So right from risk to fraud detection to even insurance underwriting, if all of us have sensors in our cars that are logging data about how fast we're going, where we're parking, where we're going, essentially you don't need human underwriters to model how risky we are. Machine learning algorithms will typically start doing that. So, okay, so let me sort of end this way. So the most profitable decade in human history has also created the least amount of jobs. Okay. That's the interesting thing. We've seen the greatest increase in productivity since the Industrial Revolution in the last 10 years, the post-internet, the post-dot-com era, has also created the least amount of jobs. Companies that are very, very increasingly more profitable are actually employing fewer and fewer people incrementally every year, right? So therefore, I think what we need to be thinking about right now is I think some of the speakers mentioned, is this notion of augmented intelligence. In the near term, it's not humanoid robotics, right? I think the amount of social the jobs that will be the hardest to automate are the jobs of nurses, the jobs of high school teachers, right? Here's a fascinating example. A professor of robotics in Italy actually said that it is at this point easier to design a robot for Mars than it is to design a robot that can navigate around your house with a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old and a whole lot of mess and random furniture alignments every few hours, right? So therefore, when you look at it, I think the change is sort of more creeping upon us, and it's been upon us for about the last 30 years since the computing revolution. And I think we're starting to pay attention now simply because it is the first time that algorithms are able to do cognitively challenging jobs, at least jobs that we felt could not be automated. I mean, I guess the inflection point is Deep Blue defeating Kasparov in 1995, but since then, right down to Watson with Ken Jennings being defeated by that, so on, what we're now seeing is that the future is really about a discussion not to do with technology. I think technology will keep moving on. It's really a debate about politics. John Maynard Keynes said that with automation, he foresees that people will actually work less, that we would work 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. Strangely enough, that seems to have not happened. Right? So that's a political question. It's not really a technology question. So I think with that, well, I'll end my...
Okay, last up, Timandra.
I feel very low tech with my my notes in my notebook.
Wow.
There you go, old school. So yeah, Martin mentioned that I've done this radio program on the singularity. I'm guessing if you're in this session, you may already all know that the singularity is this idea that artificial intelligence will reach a point where it's actually smarter than we are. And then at that point, obviously, all bets are off, because if it's smarter than we are, it's laying down the rules. So in the course of this program, I got to talk to lots of very smart, interesting people, and they fell into 3 camps. 2 of the camps were people who were really convinced that this was going to happen and happen within our lifetimes. And they were very smart people. Not all of them artificial intelligence people, but some smart people. And those 2 camps were the ones who thought this will definitely happen. And when it does happen, the artificial intelligence will realise that we humans are superfluous and wipe us out. They seem quite sanguine about this, most of them. And then the other half were the ones who thought it will definitely happen. But when it does happen, this artificial intelligence will be smarter than us, so it will solve all the problems. It will come up with solutions we haven't even thought of. It will know what's best, and it will know how to get there, and it will be able to do it. And so that's that we can just relax, basically. As long as we work towards this, then once we reach this point where the artificial intelligence is smarter than us, it will solve all the problems. And then there's the third group of people who, like me, going, I don't see how you can ever possibly reproduce human thought, because it's far too complicated and mysterious. But I'm telling you this not because I think we are headed for the singularity anytime, actually, but because it seems to be an extreme form of the kind of attitudes people have towards robotics, both physical robots and the things that Ashok was describing, the, if you like, cognitive robots, that people are quite inclined to think either it's going to be the worst thing in the world and the robots will if not wipe us out, take all our jobs and leave the majority of us as worthless, kind of superfluous human beings. Or they think, great, robots will solve everything, like the idealists that Alan was describing, that all the social, political, ethical, physical problems we have in the world, robots will solve them all. And again, I fall into a third camp, which is that it's not really about the robots. Will they make us all superfluous? No. Will they solve all our problems? No. So the great thing about speaking last is that other people have covered loads of the things, so I don't need to say them. We've got a really good overview. So I'll just throw in a couple of thoughts, really. I think it's great that we've had all the different kind of forms of robotics raised and discussed, because I do think it's true that a lot of the automation is going to be automation of thinking tasks, of routine thinking tasks. And it has been argued that because this means that it's routine middle-class jobs, routine white-collar jobs, that's making connections between things, the insurance, the banking, that kind of thing, that it's those jobs that are going, that perhaps this will have a different social effect. I'm not so sure. But although they do have the potential to take over a lot of jobs that we wouldn't necessarily want to do, because a lot of these are very routine jobs, data entry, the kind of hand calculations that we tend not to have to do anymore. And who would argue that it's a great thing for human beings to spend their time doing that, any more than saying, oh, it's a pity that robots are taking over the dirty, dangerous work in factories or mines or so on. It's not that we necessarily want to do those jobs. I think what worries me, a couple of things worry me about the potential of this. One of them is that actually they're not ambitious enough. We're not talking about robots reorganising entire sectors. Instead of saying, well, perhaps we don't need this to happen at all anymore. Perhaps we could completely move on. Instead of saying, well, great, now we've got robots, we could actually colonise the moon and mine the helium-3 and have nuclear fusion and have completely clean, unproblematic energy and loads of it. Nobody's saying that. They're saying, oh, well, we could have robots that will make software that makes lorries a bit more efficient, for example, so we use less fuel. So there's a lot of doing the same thing with less, doing things more efficiently, rather than saying, actually, there's some amazing technological potential here. The same kind of technology that makes self-driving cars feasible and safe, we could have flying cars. The problem with flying cars is not the flying, it's the not letting them all bump into each other. If you can have self-driving cars, okay, it's 3 dimensions and not 2. I'm sure it's harder, but why aren't we shooting for that? Flying cars at last. So I think that's one problem, is that actually we're not ambitious enough for our robots. We're only looking for incremental improvements in what we're already doing, and we should actually be saying, do we have the potential to transform whole sectors? But the other thing is, I don't think we can be over-relaxed about new jobs arising to replace the old jobs. Because if you look back at previous industrial revolutions, you think, okay, well, the hand weavers had a dreadful time to start with, but in the long run, there was so much demand for people to work in the new factories that everybody had new jobs, and in the long run, we all live in a better world because we have all the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. But that was happening at a time when the economy was growing. The economy was booming. There were new things happening all the time. And so that meant that new jobs were being created because of economic growth. Whereas at the moment, I don't need to tell you that we don't really have any economic growth. And in fact, as of the last couple of days, the economic growth worldwide is looking distinctly shaky. So that, I think, is the problem we need to look at. Not that the robots are going to take our jobs and that there won't be any replacement jobs, but that the robots are not going to solve the problem of a stagnant world economy. And that's what we need to solve, so that we can have robots really transforming our lives and doing amazing things and freeing us up to be creative and caring and actually live better human lives. Although, personally, though, I'd like to think that robots can't take creative jobs. I have heard there's a robot stand-up comedian on the circuit, so I may need retraining.
So what I want to do now is, for the sort of next sort of 10, 15 minutes or so, is just to kind of throw out a few questions to the panel, given what you've already said. and just see if we maybe tease out some of these kind of arguments they've been making. Because in one sense, I guess, the way I've understood it is you're roughly saying the same sort of thing. You know, kind of taking up Timandra's point about ambition, that is the goal, but then perhaps we are dissuaded from that because of perhaps some kind of cultural anxiety towards robotics and even towards investment as well, that Isabel was saying. And you know, is that really the root of the issue?
Some of this also has to do with our understanding of history itself. Historically, right from the invention of the printing press, the leading intellectuals of the day actually argued against it. They said it's the worst idea ever. This idea of people gaining knowledge in the privacy of their own homes from this infernal printed thing, as opposed to coming to church to get knowledge communally, was one of the major problems that intellectuals cited. And we've also heard the fact that television was going to dumb our children down and so on. And we've also now seen that what used to be attention deficit disorder applied generally is now continuous partial attention, which is now a virtue. So in some sense, there is a cultural tendency for us to forget large historic eras where disruptive change happened, and we've dealt with that. Right from the invention of sort of farming and agriculture with what it did to the next era where we eventually did the Industrial Revolution, and now this revolution, the robotic revolution, if you will, they all follow the same pattern. So there is this deep-seated fear. I think the second question is also that there was this interesting provocative point made by an economist recently, that why are we worried about jobs, in the sense that why are jobs an important metric in this new world? Maybe they're not. Maybe when robots do much of the menial work that we do, and they should. I mean, no human being should be dealing with nuclear waste disposal, for example, or garbage disposal, for that example. There's a class of dangerous jobs, even at low-hanging fruit, that human beings should be doing, right? So in the future, if many of these kinds of jobs and middle-class jobs are automated, maybe the right way to think about it is not in terms of jobs at all. Maybe measure this in terms of the amount of free time we've freed up for human beings to do other things, which then therefore gets into political, cultural things again.
Okay, Alan, your sort of point was, I guess, in response to how to understand and manage potential of robotics, I guess was more about sort of defining standards and regulation. Is that sort of kind of correct? So, you know, is that your sort of kind of potential sort of way to kind of answer the problem about how to kind of get robotics more sort of into the mainstream consciousness, to kind of at least define the limits around them and what their potential is?
Well, partially, yes, but I think the real answer to the final point you made there is openness and transparency. And you know, to come back to the point you made about this kind of curious cultural resistance, if you like, fear is the right word. You know, the problem that we have as roboticists is that most people think, when you ask them to think of a robot, they think of R2-D2 or Terminator or one of, you know, the point is that robotics in culture, in our in our cultural imagination, have been defined by science fiction. And as Ashok quite rightly said, I mean, there are a lot of robots in the world. The estimate currently is something of the region of 20 million. But most of those robots are unseen. They're behind the scenes. And the thing that's happening now, if you like, what I call the second wave of robotics, is robots that are designed primarily to work in human spaces. So workplace assistant robots, companion robots, caring robots, and so on. And of course, immediately that raises, you know, fears that it's the machine in the image of man, you know, the golem, the Frankenstein monster, all, you know, the Matrix, all of that stuff. So you know, in a sense, you know, the robotics research and industry, if you like, is in a bind. We have to, you know, not only try and bring benefit to humanity, but also somehow, you know, counter this cultural fear. it's more than a fear. It's a fear and a fascination.
Yeah.
You know, and perhaps the best way to sum it up, and you know, I do a reasonable amount of press and media. You know, I recall being called by a science journalist, very well-respected science journalist of a Sunday broadsheet, and he said to me, did you know that there was a meeting of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence to discuss robot ethics? This is about 5 years ago. And I said, no, I didn't. But, you know, fine. It's a perfectly reasonable thing that roboticists do. You know, we meet to talk about the ethical implications, societal implications of robotics. Actually, in a sense, behaving responsibly. The story appeared, in fact, in the Sunday paper. The story was about scientists behaving responsibly. The headline was, "Scientists fear a revolt of killer robots." That really says it all.
I mean, Francis, so, you know, from what you said and what I sort of understood, isn't the world you're sort of painting, you know, in terms of kind of the relationship with robots and humans, quite far down the line? Ideally, you're saying that what we should be doing ourselves is more the sort of the caring type kind of roles or work, and get the robots to do the dirty stuff. All sounds good, but then as a kind of creative type myself, sometimes at least, I actually like doing all the horrible stuff sometimes as well, because it kind of makes you sort of more in touch with the material world around you. So aren't you necessarily, you know, painting a slightly different kind of picture of the world we want to be in, compared to maybe, say, what Timandra's saying, which is primarily more about sort of ambition and technology?
I guess what I'm saying is that unless robotics changes hugely, and I take Timandra's point about artificial intelligence, but we aren't there yet by any means with artificial intelligence is taking over and becoming the minds that control us. We're nowhere near that at the moment. We control them. And while we control them, we can choose what we want to do. And I feel that we need, in a way, to take ownership of that and not feel that we have to be in some way defined by what the robots can do. We need to define what we want to do and what we don't want to do. And the robots, I'm sorry, get to do the things that we don't want to do. Yeah.
But I haven't met, but my point is, I guess, sorry to interrupt, but I haven't necessarily met right now a bossy robot.
No, they don't exist.
And if I did, I'd certainly pull the plug off.
Exactly. What more can I say? It is our choice. The whole thrust of what I was saying was that we fear something that we actually control. It doesn't control us, we control it, and yet we fear it. I find this quite bizarre. It's almost like we want to fear, it seems to be more a fear of what it might do if we stop controlling it. But why are we going to stop controlling it? Okay. In the end, robots and computer systems and so forth are defined by humans.
Okay. I mean, Isabel, I mean, I was very interested to what you were saying, you know, with regard to kind of investment and the sort of what I would determine the sort of, you know, culture which says as a company we're not spending, you know, in a very sort of forward-focused manner as being a problem. So I myself work with large organisations. I see it, and there's obviously great potential in robotics, but it's not even anywhere near their future agenda. So how, you know, what's your sort of response? I mean, how are you, in your own capacities as a consultant and so on, how are you sort of trying to convince these companies to put their hands in their pockets and start spending on this very interesting, fascinating stuff?
I think, can I just come back
please.
to one of Francis's points? Your point about, you know, we determine the robots and we determine. One of the things that I think, and it does link to my point about the investment actually, is I think there are areas when we're on the verge of that. Ashok talked about high frequency trading and the algorithms that are used. Now those are designed for a very small number of extremely clever people. And when you start looking at dark pool trading and the margins that an algorithm can take off a trade, and then the wealth that goes to a very small group of individuals, that is incredibly hard to regulate and control. So I think there are areas where we are maybe further down that chain than we think in terms of controlling this, or at least controlling the people who are developing
Like
it.
it.
Yeah, but how do we get the investment in this? I think there are a number of different things we need to do. One, it was interesting. Alan and I were talking earlier, and it was about the socialisation of robots and socialisation of the themes and the things they can do. And I think we need to get some excitement about this. If we take things like the Mars rover, we all got behind it, and that was a very small amount of investment into something that was really exciting, but wasn't seen as a threat to our culture, wasn't seen as a threat, it was something we can get behind. So I think we need to have a few flagship ideas that people can get excited about and people can understand the impact. In terms of the investment, I think that there needs to be more encouragement to organisations, there needs to be more funding, and looking at maybe what are the tax incentives to do so, but there needs to be a general cultural switch, both from a government point of view, from a regular point of view, that's encouraging investment into it, and a bringing the population along with it in terms of let's generate some excitement about this.
Okay. Timandra, so you made the point about ambition, which I personally entirely agree with. But are there certain areas where we're actually doing very ambitious things with robotics already? So perhaps it's never going to be a sort of an even sort of spread across all areas and industries and parts of culture where we would always automatically get excited about potential robotics.
Well, you certainly could argue that some of the machine learning and things like internet searches, for example, and translation, are doing extraordinary things very quickly, technologically speaking. I think it's much harder to put your finger on what difference that is making. If we focus on the economy, okay, we can all now go and find things out from all over the world at the drop of a hat. I was talking to someone in a bar last night, as you do, about somebody's got a project to look for all the images of animals on the internet, and apparently there are quite a lot, and classify them according to their genus and species.
Have we moved beyond cats now?
Yeah, all the animals, not even just cats. And you think about that, I think that's an extraordinary thing to be able to do that, to be able to have, and obviously they're still working on it, it's very problematic. As Ashok said, recognising pictures is something we do incredibly well without even knowing it, and computers still really struggle with. But they're getting on fast enough that they're designing a program that can go through the amazing amassing of human knowledge that the internet represents and find pictures of animals all over the world and go, okay, so what animal is this? Can we recognise it? Can we work out what animal it is? Can we fit it into the tree of life? And then can we make maybe a note of where in the world it was and when it was? So it's a kind of automated encyclopedia of all the animals in the world. When you think about that, that's an amazing thing. And lots of things like that are happening. So it has great potential, but in terms of what impact that is having on the world, it's much harder to say, well, what benefits are we getting from that? And I would never say you mustn't do it unless it's going to have an economic benefit. I'd be the last person to say that. But if we are trying to think, are the robots our friends in the economic sphere? Are they going to take our jobs or give us all a life of leisure where we only have to work 2 hours a week and can lie in our hammocks looking at pictures of animals on the internet or whatever lights your candle?
Some people do that already.
Then I think that's, and it's not it's not really about the robots. It's about what vision we have for the world.
Can I just ask a really basic question, because I am slightly confused and I've helped set up this debate. Aren't we somewhat talking just about computational power rather than robotics? Because sometimes I always thought, think about this debate. Well, here's a challenge to yourselves, because I was always thinking this debate is more about the kind of really bad example, like sort of Metal Mickey sort of idea of a robot who is automating production, taking the strain out of the world and doing a lot of sort of automated physical labour and tasks. But a lot of what you're saying is more just generally about computational power.
It's about much more than that.
Oh, here we go. We're all getting warmed up.
Can I pick up?
Actually,
Ashok wants to say something as well.
So I think, for starters, I think the line's blurred already. You can't separate computation from anything nowadays. With 3D printing, materials are now essentially software models, as is everything. So I'll give you a classic example. I think even in the image recognition space, right? The challenge, there's basically two kinds of AI. So there's sort of model-driven AI, and then there's like data-driven AI. We've got significantly good at data-driven AI. I mean, which is how search engines work, right? And that's where human beings terribly fall short. We can't process petabytes of data really fast, right? And computation has now gotten fast to the point where I can brute force better image recognition simply by having those algorithms learn from, literally, petabytes of images, right? Same thing. I can look at even the Kasparov defeat was not an elegant defeat of a better strategy. It was a brute force data-driven strategy in that it literally had a database of all games ever it had. It could detect patterns. So here's the thing. So we human beings are good at detecting complex patterns in a very short amount of time. Computers are good at detecting simple patterns from massive volumes of data. And those are the kinds of things that you will see everywhere. So even right down to material sciences, one of the interesting challenges, which I'm sure the professor will be aware of, is that it's incredibly hard to design robots to even grasp and handle things that human beings do with phenomenal dexterity. Right?
So I guess my point is, and someone else, come back to it, surely that's where we need to be spending more time in, if you like, rather less in the computational side of it, but more in terms of the actual nuance of the mechanics of what these kind of physical robots themselves should be or could be doing.
Okay.
And I just want to sort of wrap up this in about 5 minutes. So
Yes, well, what I was going to say was sort of back to an earlier point, that the point at which we start to get worried is the point at which humans, robots, or we start automating things that large numbers of people or important people do. And that's the point at which we start to get worried. And so which is why we start to get worried about, for example, the automation of production lines. We have played this scene before, of course, because we had automation of jobs in the Industrial Revolution, and other jobs emerged to take their place. My problem with all of this, because I take Timandra's point about just because it happened before doesn't mean it would happen again, and why do we want to work anyway? And I have some sympathy for that one, but I would say it's a more fundamental question than that, which is the way in which we tend to define what we mean by work. Because we have a rather narrow definition of work. Work is what you get paid for. But in my world, work is just what I do. It's activity. And if I was to use a physical definition, work is simply activity. Who decides whether it's paid or not? It's just something I want to do.
let's leave it there. So Alan, have you got a very short sort of response? Because I want to bring the audience back in.
Sure. Very quickly, just to a robot, in my definition, is very simply an embodied artificial intelligence. Now, the thing that we've discovered is really, really hard is the embodiment part. Okay, so as Ashok quite rightly said, even very simple tasks for humans are well beyond the capabilities of current robots. Now, just to finish, Martin, solving that problem is not just about computational power.
Yeah,
it's not.
Okay, brilliant. So we've warmed up, and now it's your turn.
Comment and flippant and not so flippant point. The comment is, as you automate more and more things, I'm not sure that jobs will be lost. If you look at America, what will happen is that you'll simply have more overhead people trading with each other, lawyers or what have you. Certainly that's what's happened in the States, probably less so in Europe. Serious comment, is there danger of becoming too clever? It's like the railway pricing model, very clever filling trains up, but I heard a senior manager say it's possibly broken. It's a bit like trading. Yes, you can do it, but at the end of the day, the idea is it provides liquidity. Is it actually going too far? Do we need all that liquidity? My fairly flippant point, if you look at Star Trek, once Mr. Dave is very close to marrying a Starfleet officer. Not sure about Mr. Dave, if you had his female counterpart, and I married her, she's been programmed by Asimov, those 3 points, so effectively she won't stab me and she'll be very servile. Superficially, it's very attractive. I have a servile wife who will work all day, bring the money in, then do the housework in the evening. When you think about it in more detail, I start worrying a little bit about that. If every human had a very servile spouse, who was robotic, what effect would that have? The more I think about it, the more I worry.
Timandra, you mentioned that robots are not going to replace us, and there'll still be need for humans when the robots are around, and that's a point that I agree with you. What I'd like to challenge is that on a global scale, on a macro level, the economy is stagnant at the moment, and robots are not going to come in and solve this problem. Do you have my agreement?
I'll take
Timandra
Timandra back in a minute with more questions.
They're not going to solve the problem of a stagnant economy, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
Now, if we stop looking at the macro level of global growth, but come down to a micro level, what is growth to me? Growth to me is if I gain more skills, if I'm able to do a job better. That's growth to me. If I gain a new skill, if I gain new knowledge, that's growth to me. Why then, if the robots are going to now do the jobs better than us, we're not going to have growth in the world?
I just wanted to expand on a point that all of you have sort of alluded to with, the reduction of jobs as we move into a more revolutionised stage. But would you ever see sort of the makeup of the whole, political standpoint of, if we're losing, say, half of all of the UK's jobs disappear into automation, would you see the way we live our lives change? So would we all effectively, rather than being on benefits from not working, would that be just a normal level? If you're not working, you get 20k a year just to do as you wish, be creative, like live your lives as you want. And then if you did do some extra, if you were working, would you then just reach a higher stage? I was expanding upon that.
It's fantastic points being made, and I'm just glad that something about robot ethics is coming. My question is, and this I think comes sort of at the end of this revolution that we have in this industrial age, are robots our slave or are they our equal? And what I really want to ask is, could, would and should legally have a robot have the same sort of rights as us? And it's sort of that idea of, we've gone through the whole industrialization where we use slaves to build our economy. We've used slavery. And if a robot is designed so much like us, how long will it take before it just doesn't want to be that anymore and it becomes our sort of equal?
Jobs are taken over, 50% of the jobs are taken over by robots. Is it realistic to think that these humans will just lounge around at home and work 3 hours a week? I can't really see it happening. I think they'd probably be unemployed, be on benefits. The rich will get richer. Do you think it will increase the divide if you have robots and they don't have to pay wages to their employees anymore?
My name is Majid Bashir. I come from Pakistan, and maybe that's why my question is related to the application of robots in the battlefield and the collateral damage. Collateral damage is something that we have very different perceptions about. We in Pakistan see it very up close. You hear news on the TV that a drone, misfired or hit the wrong target and something happened, but we see the kids killed and bodies in pieces. So I give 3 examples. First, Stephen Dale Green, who was charged in America for raping and killing the 14-year-old in Iraq. So he was sentenced for life. So in Afghanistan, another soldier, Robert Bales, he killed 16 civilians, sentenced for life. So we see accountability. Now, if we have robots and we have a drone that fires a missile, and it has happened. WikiLeaks gave the reports that the militant escaped, the family was killed. Now, the person behind operating the drone, there's no accountability. But Robert Dale and Stephen Dale and Robert, they were on the battlefields, they were sentenced. So now we have too many robots, too much technology. So where will the battlefield accountability come from? And how will the sentencing take place?
Perfect. I mean, in the last 10 minutes, we've had amazing array of questions. So we've got kind of about leisure time. Are we all going to fall asleep, spend our days by the swimming pool? We've got the ethics of the battlefield, which is fascinating. We've got the whole issue about jobs. We've got servitude. And, again, coming back to the point about stagnation and growth, what are we really talking about when we talk about growth? And obviously, can robots make a difference there? Right, so who wants to come back? And I'd encourage you to probably just respond to 1 or 2 things rather than the whole gamut, because otherwise we won't get more questions in. So who wants to go first?
Can I
Francis.
come back to 2 questions, which were to do with this whole question of automation and jobs, and because you raised something that actually I've talked about a lot. I suppose the fear of being made worthless, redundant, if you like, is very deep-seated for people, and I think that's where a lot of the fear of automation comes from. And you can see this positively in terms of, well, we can all have lots more time to do all the things that we would like to do but don't have time to do because we're spending all our time working. Or we can see it as we will have nothing to do. I personally incline towards the first of those, but I do take your point over here about the possibility that the future for an awful lot of people might be poverty. And that really raises questions about the ordering of our society in a world where most production is done is not done by humans. Who owns the robots and who benefits from the products of the labour of robots? And that touches on your question also about slavery.
Okay.
We need to think seriously about how we order a society in a post-technological world.
Very good. Who's next?
Shall I? Since
Yes.
one of the questions is directed specifically to me, and then I think actually one of the other questions really relates to the idea of economic growth. So I mean, I seem to be. I think your point was okay. Economic growth worldwide is all very well, but to me as a person, why should I care about world economic growth when me learning, being creative, learning new skills is what constitutes growth for a person? Is that a rough? As an individual, I think it's a fair point to say economic growth is not the most and only important thing to human beings. I mean, we think back to periods where, before we had loads of economic growth, about Shakespeare's time, they didn't have all the benefits we have from the Industrial Revolution, and yet you only need to read or see Shakespeare's plays to know that they were every bit as human as we are today, every bit as much of a human being. So you don't need an advanced, industrialised, economically growing society to be an enriched human being. That's absolutely true. Nevertheless, the fact that we have had economic growth and industrialisation enables us all to be here at a weekend sitting in a room, warm, dry, well-fed, most of us reasonably well educated, healthy, not having died in infancy, which used to be the fate of between 1 in 7 and 1 in 10 children, even as recently as like 150 years ago. We're not in factories on a Saturday morning. We have chosen to come here to Barbican to have these important discussions, and living in an advanced society enables those kinds of things to happen. And so that's why I think economic growth is important, because not only does it allow us to keep expanding these opportunities open to us, but it means, I certainly aspire for everyone in the world to have these kind of opportunities and more in the future. So I think it shouldn't be dismissed, even though it's not the be-all and end-all, which brings me on to your point about, well, it's all very well to say, we can all work 3 hours a week and then lie in a hammock. But in reality, is that what would happen? Or would you get half the people would get the well-paid jobs that robots can't do, and the other half of the people be left on the scrap heap on subsistence? And that's a very real question. It's a political question, obviously. Yes. It's not a technological question. But it's related to the economic growth thing, because if what you have is a pie that is getting bigger, then what we're arguing over is shares of an expanding pie, which is a slightly odd mental image. But it means that there is actually scope to say, well, look, how can people usefully contribute to society? We can afford for society to actually say, well, you know what, these things are great and valuable contributions, even though they're not actually adding to the monetary bottom line, and so we as a society are gonna pay for them, much as we do now and have done in the past in better economic times. So I think again that's another reason not to dismiss economic growth, because actually if you accept that we're not going to have any more of anything, then how you share it out and whether some people are now not contributing and therefore are going to be pushed aside becomes a very real question. You want to be shut up, don't you? Far away.
I'm being polite. Alan, great question, I would say, for you about the ethics of robots and war. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's an incredibly tough question, and so the gentleman from Pakistan, In fact, there is currently a campaign. It's called the International Campaign for Robot Arms Control, and I recommend that you check the website. What I'm very pleased to say is that the campaign is getting some traction. There have been presentations made at United Nations and so on, and many roboticists, myself included, believe that there is a line that has to be drawn. That robotics, for instance, that robots should not be weaponized, especially autonomous robots. In other words, robots where the trigger is pulled, as it were, by an artificial intelligence rather than a human being. I'm not an expert in military ethics, but from those I know who are, my understanding actually is that right now the rules of engagement, in fact, are very clear, and there are people responsible. Now, whether those human beings are called to account, of course, is a whole other question. But I think, I feel optimistic given this campaign for robot arms control.
You obviously fight a good war, because my experience of war is it's always messy, but we can come back to that.
We can come back to that. There are huge. I think there are moral arguments that we should not have weaponized robots, but there are also very good technical arguments that simply, that robots just aren't smart enough to tell the difference. For instance, between a combatant with a gun and a teenager with a wooden stick. And it's going to be a long time into the future.
Okay. Isabel and Ashok, do you want to come back to some points?
Your point, I think it's very important that whoever is, the people are taking responsibility for the technology they put out there. We cannot put technology out there and then wash our hands of it and say we've designed it, and now it's off doing its own thing. Behind drones, there is somebody who is controlling them, who has developed them, and there is an organisation that's put them out there, and they need to take responsibility for them.
I'll probably preface this with one basic framework that will address a couple of the questions at least. One is that when we think about this revolution, I think the rules of the game have changed, which means that we need to think about them very differently from a policy standpoint and so on. And that applies to everyone. So I'll take the example of the entertaining question about the servile robots and human laziness, if you will. I think on the one hand, I think it would be significantly better for human beings to exploit a robot as a slave than a real human being. So in that sense, that would still be an improvement. The second aspect of this is that it would represent a new class of addiction problems, a new class of social problems that we would have to deal with. And I think Neil Stephenson's books are full of these. People who are addicted to virtual worlds, who don't want to come out into the real world, and so on. So that's one thing, right? I think the other question about the political and the economic impact of robots. Again, I think the problem again is I alluded to it, which is that we need to think about economics very differently. We need to think about what constitutes growth, what constitutes wellness, what constitutes. I'll quote Professor Andrew McAfee, right? So the author of The Second Machine Age. He said, the current definition of GDP does not even account for the effect of the internet.
No, it doesn't.
So there are some fundamental problems in the way our economic models need to evolve. So we'll have to have newer definitions of what it means to be happy, and what the whole social sort of welfare state is going to be in a robotically automated state. We don't have answers yet, but we need to have those discussions. And I think the last one was about I'll take is the Star Trek question about whether they will also have the same rights as human beings. Okay. And I think the classic example here is the classic Star Trek episode, The Measure of Man, where Data is put on. Somebody wants to disassemble him, and Picard eloquently argues that no, we have to give the rights that we gave. He made the same thing. We've gone through slavery, and this is a new species, and so on. But I think again, we're not there yet. So in some senses, again, to quote Professor Andrew McAfee, I'll worry about self-aware robots when my computer is first aware of my printer. So, I think there is time for that, but we'll have to think about it.
Just not there.
My house this morning, there was no self-awareness, I can assure you. Right, I have 5 more hands, and then I'll ask more people.
I'm an industrialist with many years' experience in building businesses that have used robots, and latterly in the financial markets as well. My point is more about the ethics of people. In the case of financial markets, the robots that are currently trading, if a human did what that robot did, the human would be locked up. Because a lot of these robots are doing the robotic equivalent of something called front running, which is illegal. And the danger to society from that sort of very, very fast but illegal activity done by a robot that actually can't be detected by the New York Stock Exchange poses a real threat to society. In terms of the future, a lot of the activity in robotics over time has been in reducing human labour. And there's a scale of diminishing returns there because you need quite large capital investment. And one of the questions I have for the panel, if you take to one side the ethics, the human ethics side of how you use robots. But I'll give you an example from a company that was founded earlier this year, where a product in the market leader in the world used to take 24 hours to make. And the normal response in the developed world is, let's make that product with a robot. It will cost less. Instead, what happened in this particular case was the management team redesigned the product, and they can now make it in 2 minutes by hand in a farm with the dog sitting under their desk, and their margins went up, and they don't need the investment in robots, and they can make it in anywhere in the world because labour cost is not an issue. So my question is, do you see that, as I certainly do, as the future of robotics in terms of not actually needing them in the first place and avoiding the high-speed illegal stuff that humans would normally try and get them to do?
Thank you very much.
My name is Alison, and I don't know how many of you watched the movie. It's a conspiracy movie called Zeitgeist by Peter Joseph, I believe. And he's talking about a project called Venus Project, saying that with the technology that we have today or could develop in the near future, we'd already be able to create like a utopia where nobody would have to work anymore and everybody would have leisure. But he says that it's actually the bourgeoisie opposing this project because they benefit from the scarcity that we still have today and creating their monopoly and ruling over the proletariat in a way. So who is it actually that is opposing the robots? Is it the society that is scared of that they would lose, that the productive work would be overtaken by robots, or is it the bourgeoisie who would scare that there would be no scarcity anymore, that would kind of in a way, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Alan, you put me at a real quandary because I loved what you said, but I also, part of it I just disagreed with. I loved the idealist and they're being brilliant. The problem I had was with the ethics, because I think what happens with this technology socially, politically, can't be determined by a set of ethical protocols, whatever the good intentions. And I'll give you an example from my favourite piece of transformative technology already mentioned, the printing press. Catholic Church didn't fear the printing press, they welcomed it. Nicholas d'Acusa said it was a divine gift of God because it could standardise the Bible. You didn't have to rely on haphazard monks and scriptoriums. Gutenberg, who was a technological entrepreneur, loved this, could make a buck, roll out the Bibles, papal indulgences as well. The game changer was something that had nothing to do with the technology. It came from elsewhere. It was a political and social force from elsewhere, which was the ideas of the Protestant Reformation and Luther. So I think what happens with this, you can't control the political, the social ideas that could transform what we do with this technology. The technology is neutral. And as Martin's already said, war is a messy business, and we hope this technology wouldn't be used for that. But that's not why wars will happen.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more, and then the panel will come back.
I've got a brief question about timing. We've heard that some jobs are going to be lost through automation and robots, and some new ones may be created working in partnership with them. Which of those happens first, or do they happen at the same time, and in what relative volumes?
Great discussion, thank you all very much. clearly consensus about the potential of robots. So I think the discussion focuses, or the questions, not for us, perhaps the next 10 minutes, focus on what are the barriers to the realization of that potential. And the balance I would give is a bit different to what's been said on the platform, is I think when you're looking at either the economic or the cultural constraints on robots, those have got nothing to do with robots in themselves. The constraints are outside the robot technology, and in some ways focusing too much on what's happening in IT and computers and robotics misses that bigger picture. I mean, in terms of what Isabel said, agree 100%, not enough investment going on in IT and robotics, but I think that's a very, very tiny part of the problem. The problem is that there's not enough investment going on in industries outside IT. In fact, most of the investment has been in IT, and when you don't have the broader scale investments going on, you don't have that general dynamic of expansion and progress. I mean, I may have misheard you, Ashok, but I thought you might have said that the last 10 years was amongst the fastest growth in productivity. That's, wrong. The productivity has been in decline for the last 20, 30 years in Western countries. There was a bit of a blip at the end of the 1990s, but it's been in steady decline, and that's not down to robots or IT. It's down to the lack of broader scale investment going on. Just leave you with a metaphor, or a parallel rather, from history. Electrification. If you look at how the economic and social benefits of electrification happened, it took a long time, of course, from 1880s to the interwar years, but the key thing was that there was developments going on in industries outside electrification. It was what was happening to factory reorganization. It was what was happening to new products and processes, what was happening to consumer goods, air conditioning. Whole panoply of other industries had to have investment going on in order for those benefits to take place. And I think that's the same. Finally, just on the cultural side, just to say I agree that with the consensus that there's a cultural problem, but whereas Francis calls it a culture of fear of loss, I say it's a fear of change. I think probably gets it. Maybe the same thing, but I think it's that fear of change and progress which is problematic. And just to echo a point that was just made, on your point, Alan, where you give this very good example of how the media will give an alarmist headline, we have to expect that these days. Any discussion on ethics is not going to reassure, it is immediately going to pander to people's suspicions of things, and that has to be taken head on if we are to challenge effectively the culture of change, the culture of progress, which is what's holding back that widespread investment, which is what we need today.
Point sparked off by what a point Ashok made about the role of the intellectuals at the time of the printing and pressing, stuff like that. I agree with most of the stuff people have said on the panel, but to me, large-scale automation is ultimately something, whether it's building huge numbers of houses, mining using robots, whatever, it's got to to be good, it's got to have a really good big impact on increasing the human footprint. But to me nowadays, the intellectual classes or layers, whatever you want to call it, have a view. Their default view is that keeping the human footprint at the same level, not increasing it, is a bad thing. So I'd like the panel to maybe think about the idea of, is it today's intellectual classes that are actually the barrier to things like robots, etc., and actually increasing the footprint on Earth as opposed to Mars.
Okay. Who wants to take up some of these challenges?
I'll take the question. I think both that gentleman asked about the accountability, and I think it also relates to what the earlier gentleman said about the drones and so on, right? So when you look at criminal activities in the sense of trading algorithms, essentially breaking the law in order to make wealth, in my mind, I think that's a simpler problem to solve in the future than some more tricky dilemmas that we will end up seeing. I'll give you an example, right? A tricky dilemma is what happens when self-driving cars get into accidents, right? Yeah. Self-driving cars, for example, if they have to make a decision to kill the people in the car in order to save a school bus, is that okay? Is that morally, ethically okay? We don't know. I mean, we've never had those discussions. This has never been something. So I think the trickier moral dilemmas will help us. We'll have to discuss those now before people start designing algorithms. Right? So that's one of the things.
Who's next? I'm just encouraging speakers to be brief so we get more questions in.
I can pick up this whole question of about the bigger picture, and I need to respond to the timing of jobs because I don't know the answer to that. The fear of loss and fear of change are very closely related. In economics, we talk about creative destruction, the idea that in order for you to move on in change and develop something new, something has to die. And we hang on like mad to the old. And we're hanging on like mad to the old. And the bigger the change facing us, the more we want to hang on to what we're about to lose. And there will be losers in this process. There always are. And the problem is how we support the people who are going to lose, the people with the skills that will become obsolete, the people who just don't manage to make the transition into a different type of world, those type of things. And we have to solve those problems. But we shouldn't prevent the change from happening just because of fear of what we might lose. Because if we do, we won't gain what we could gain from this.
You know, I've talked quite a lot about robot ethics, and this, I think, reflects a number of the questions just now. But what I haven't mentioned is ethical robots. And I think that ethical robots are now a very real possibility, and certainly worth thinking about debating and exploring.
Okay.
I just wanted to come back to, again, the point that was made about taking the concept of a robot and then re-engineering a process, and then the gentleman at the back who was saying, yes, his point about investment is not just in technology, it is wider in our industries. And again, yes, I support that point. It isn't, I think very often now when we're thinking about robotics, we're thinking about automating what we already do. Yes. We're not going back to the fundamentals of what is it we're trying to achieve, and is there fundamentally a better way to do it. And I think the outcome could involve robots, but it could be a different way, and both need to be.
Brilliant. So I'll just get a couple more questions, and I'm going to get the speakers to kind of wrap up or sum up.
I just wanted to share that I have met a bossy robot. She's called Sarah. She's a cheap sat-nav. She has out-of-date maps.
Ah, yes, sat-navs.
There are certain roads I drive down where she gets very, very upset because she doesn't think they exist. The serious point out of that, though, I think is how ready we are to invest personality into things as soon as we give them a voice or a face or some sense of being a sentient being. Very quickly, people start to have a relationship with robots, and I think a lot of the ethical questions will come actually much quicker than we expect, not because the robots are necessarily really thinking hard, but because we think they may be, because we are very ready to turn them into personalities.
This is more to supplement Timandra's point. A few months ago, the Japanese Institute of Science and Technology began research on quantum levitation for vehicles. That allows flying cars which can, when they crash, they'll overlap over each other, going on different electromagnetic fields. However, that does remove the aspect of self-driving cars, because the onboard computers would get screwed up.
I can well imagine. Timandra.
So many different themes emerged here. So I think there was a very good point raised, a couple of good points about are ethics the right way to approach this? Obviously, we're all kind of agreed that it's not about the technology, and the impact of the technology is not going to be determined by the technology. And talking about the ethics is one way to put that in perspective. But that kind of goes against my instinct, which is that research and technology should be unfettered and imaginative and exploratory and ambitious and think big. I think that these kind of discussions about the way things should go need to happen outside of the field of ethics in a way, because I'm still slightly feeling my way towards what I think here, because I think it comes down to more about what is your vision of the future. A lot of stuff about AI and robotics is just a reflection of what we think about ourselves as human beings. So if you think that the singularity is going to wipe us off the face of the planet, that often reflects the idea that actually you think human beings are a blight to the planet anyway. And so you kind of, part of you is going, well, an AI would know that and wipe us out. If you think that actually all of human thought could be modelled in a machine, then that's obviously what you think about how we think. And I think that our attitudes to technology, our kind of fears and our limited hopes also reflect what we think of ourselves as humans. So I think we should be guided by hope for the future, and a sense that we can't determine what the future will be like, but we can be hopeful that just as now is better in most ways than our human past, then the future can be better still.
Ashok.
Okay, so I'll leave this with one point, which is that fundamentally technology is on this accelerated march. I think artificial intelligence will keep getting better and better. So I think the the bigger problem, and those have been raised by many of you as questions, is really about how do we think of this differently in political and economic terms, right? And in policy and other terms. I'll leave you with a very simple example. We're worried about intellectual property theft as a result of 3D printing. We're also worried about gun violence on the other side. But honestly speaking, we have to be thinking at the level of being worried about home-printed 3D guns, which is an actual problem right now. There is a gentleman in Austin, Texas, who has a wiki weapons project with YouTube videos. You can download 3D models of assault weapons, print them at home, and then fire them. There are instructions. So essentially, again, we have to deal with these singularity moments if we have to sort of wrap our heads around this revolution. Thanks.
Francis.
I think we are at some kind of change point where the problem that is posed by the technological revolution addresses not just how we use technology, but how we organise ourselves, how we manage ourselves, how we organise society, what we define as value in our society, what we mean by work in our society, what the role of human beings is. It's not what the robots do that bothers us, it's what we do and what we are and how we organise ourselves. And that's maybe a bigger problem to solve.
Alan?
We should be ambitious and visionary. Robots really have the potential for huge benefit to society, but I think robotics at the same time is too important to leave to free market capitalism.
Isabel, finally.
Actually, some of my points link very closely back to Alan's. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I think a lot of it, and even the questions, make this inherent assumption that robots will create wealth for a few and not for us generally. And I think that needs to be addressed because I don't think that necessarily has to be the answer. There has to be a different way of doing it. And we need to have some excitement. We need to have some projects we all get behind.
Brilliant. So can we give our speakers a really good round of applause because that was fascinating.